Okay, so this lecture is going to look at what's going on in Western Europe at the same time as the previous lecture on the Middle East. So, kind of leading up to the call for the First Crusade. And just a few images to kind of give you a sense of this sort of European mentality that inclined them towards there was the overwhelming response to the First Crusade. So this is a very well-known map from the Middle Ages called the Psalter map. It was probably produced in the 13th century, so not too long after the First Crusade. And in the Middle Ages, these maps all had east at the top instead of north, sort of that orientation. So if you sort of flip it, you'll see in the bottom left corner, Rome, Paris, London. It also sort of includes some mysterious places. And at the center is Jerusalem. And it's sort of round like that deliberately as it was referred to as sort of the navel of the world. So clearly this is a very religiously inspired worldview. You can see sort of Jesus at the top and sort of controlling everything that happens. So another sort of map, this is belongs to a category called Mappa Mundi or world maps, and it's from Hereford Cathedral around the same time. And it's actually one of the largest maps that we have. It's 52 inches in diameter. It has England in the northwest border, but again, sort of Jerusalem in the center, sort of right above that sea there, and representing sort of that centrality of Jerusalem in that Western medieval mind. So just a few sort of comments about the belief system generally and what these maps sort of represent. First of all, this notion that although Europe was divided into different political entities, which were all independent, most of them sort of kingdoms with monarchs in place, there was this notion that what united them was their adherence to the Roman Catholic Church. And so we do see references to this sort of larger unit called Christendom. And for many people, that would have been sort of the defining characteristic that unified them in spite of sort of the localities where they lived. You also, again, the centrality of Jerusalem. So even though the vast majority of people would have never even come close to visiting Jerusalem, it was still just sort of central in their mindset and in their sort of concept of the world. The other thing we're going to talk about is sort of the emergence of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that sort of explains in part the role of the papacy. And also the emergence of orthodoxy. That's really important in sort of understanding that Christian mindset from Western Europe during this period and why certain groups were sort of targeted as a result of these crusading efforts. So I gotta back way up and give you a very quick superficial overview of about 600 years of history, in part to sort of explain this process where the church really becomes this defined institution with a sort of this notion of orthodoxy, meaning only a single accepted interpretation of belief. So you start off in the first century AD with what scholars reference as a Jesus movement. And some of you may have encountered some of this in your other classes, which is awesome since I'm just really going to touch on it briefly here. But what we mean by the Jesus movement is when Jesus of Nazareth first starts preaching, it's not an official sort of organized belief system. He's an individual just sort of spreading his own beliefs with a handful of followers, and he's moving around this this province of Judea. So it's Roman controlled. There have been lots of issues, lots of instability. The Romans and the Jewish population increasingly at odds, and it's so into this sort of very sort of unstable environment that Jesus begins to preach a particular message to other members of the Jewish community. So what you have in the province of Judea, you have this Jewish minority within this very large Roman Empire. They're one of only two sort of faith groups in the empire that is monotheistic. And in particular, what Jesus' message is sort of focusing on is a very strong critique of wealth and power. And this is really antithetical in the ancient world. If you're a slave because the gods don't bless you. If you're rich, the gods must like you. And he really sort of flips that on its end, and he deliberately sort of challenges people with wealth and challenges people with power and reaches out to sort of more marginal individuals within the community. He also advocates this sort of withdrawal from society, this sort of internal examination of yourself. So remove yourself from sort of the ties of family, of work, of those other things that maybe will take your focus off sort of your sort of salvation. His audience, we know to start with, is just other Jews, and he really wants them to sort of accept this sort of new version of sort of a religious belief system. And initially, the reception is pretty limited. We do know that in 30 AD he goes to Jerusalem and he is arrested by Roman authorities and for sort of subversion, and eventually is crucified for treason. So very typical Roman behavior, but Jesus obviously then is no longer sort of himself actively spreading this message. So how do we get from this sort of amorphous, unstructured Jesus movement to a more formal sort of belief system, which we refer to as Christianity? The term Christian, the followers of Christus, is first used by Tacitus, who is a Roman, and it's not until considerably after the death of Jesus. And so initially there's a lot of confusion amongst Jesus's followers. He's gone, so what are we supposed to do next? And then eventually a new sort of focused message emerges, and his followers state that they have seen him in visions because while he was crucified, he returned to life briefly and then went to heaven. And so he conveyed sort of instructions to them. And the sort of immediate following of Jesus, known as his apostles, Peter Christian. So Peter was sort of the leader of these of this particular group. These are the people that knew Jesus during his lifetime, and they say, okay, we're going to continue to sort of take this message to other Jews, sort of as Jesus envisioned it. And then the other sort of strand in this early movement is an individual named Paul of Tarsus, who is from the Greek city of Tarsus. He never met Jesus in life, but he said that he had visions of Jesus. And as a result of these visions, he sort of embraced the message, became a very active Christian in sort of leading the expansion of this community. And it's Paul who says, let's take this message outside of the Jewish community, and really sort of targets different Greek cities like Ephesus and Corinth. And it's really Paul who sort of introduces this emphasis on concerns about sin, identifying certain behaviors as sinful. It's really Paul who sort of identifies the centrality of celibacy, equating sex with sin. So elevating celibacy to this sort of superior condition of individuals. But the problem is, if everyone's celibate, your movement's going to die out. So they have to sort of figure out a solution for that, which is why eventually celibacy is great for everybody, but according to Paul, not everyone can do it. So it's only sort of members of the clergy, priests, and monks and nuns. This is the same period when we start to see the first production of text. So some of the books of the New Testament, Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, and also the Pauline letters. So these all start being committed to writing in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. This is an image of one of the earliest complete texts of the New Testament. It's called the Sinaiticus, and it's in the British Library today, and it's dated to about the 4th century. So gradually then, what you start to see in the 4th century is the eventual spread of Christianity across the Middle East and then into the heartland of the Roman Empire and up into Western Europe. And a lot of this spread is really due to the conversion of Emperor Constantine in 312. who was one of the first leading Romans to embrace Christianity. And then slightly after that, Emperor Theodosius actually says, okay, not only are we going to tolerate it for now, we're actually going to make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And after that, it really does continue to grow. So as this belief system becomes larger, involves more people, there's more at stake, we start to see the emergence of more structure. And none of this was really discussed in that early message spread by Jesus, so it sort of developed as things go. One of the first things we see emerge is an ecclesiastical hierarchy. So initially, they divide this Mediterranean region up into 5 main sort of areas that are called patriarchates, and each area has sort of an official, a patriarch, and so he sort of administers and is control of all of that territory within his patriarchate. And you could see the 5. So you've got Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And then sort of subject to the authority of the patriarchs, the next level are bishops. This is the English translation of the Latin episcopus, which just means sort of overseer. So someone to sort of make sure all of the churches in that region have everything that they need. And eventually they're going to start to collect some taxation in the form of tithes. And so then the next level below bishops are priests, which comes from the Latin presbyter. So a priest is the individual who's in charge of a church. So you start to see this sort of hierarchy form, as well as obviously these individuals occupy positions of authority. And authority is central to the emergence of orthodoxy in the 4th century. One of the big questions for individuals in the early church is who has authority, who can speak authoritatively to beliefs and practices. So this is all still emerging. They're figuring everything out. And orthodoxy is sort of a perspective, an approach that says there's only one accepted set of beliefs and rituals. There's only one accepted interpretation of texts. Orthodoxy is not inevitable in all religions. A lot of religions don't have it. It's just open to everyone's interpretation. But for a variety of reasons, this is how the Roman Catholic Church evolves. And so one of the things they do to establish this sense of uniformity when you have some differences of opinion is they produce liturgy. An example of liturgy is a creed. A creed comes from the Latin term credo, I believe. It's a statement of belief. So, for example, one of the issues that's up for debate is this question of do you have authority because you had a vision of Jesus, which would have been sort of revelation? Or is it only those people sort of who learn from the apostles and occupy official positions within the church who have authority? That was a hotly debated topic, and eventually they produced the Apostles' Creed, which essentially was a statement that the only people who have authority within the church are sort of priests and other ecclesiastical officials, because they're viewed as the sort of successors to the original apostles. Personal revelation is sort of ruled out. So these creeds then are used to separate people who are consistent with Orthodox beliefs from those who aren't. And the people who are considered inconsistent with Orthodox beliefs are deemed heretics. So also, if you're going to have this uniformity, you need a single set of texts known as the canon. So they take some of these Old Testament texts, which they sort of pull from, and then they decide which of hundreds of texts that are sort of circulating in the period are going to be deemed part of the New Testament. And so part of this also involves the destruction of rivals. One of the great sort of unanswered questions about Christian belief during this period is how much we don't know. So for example, that whole question of authority, the group that lost are called Gnostics. And they basically, their communities were destroyed and a lot of their writings were destroyed. A few happened to survive, which is why we know about them. The other thing that happens is the doctrine of Petrine supremacy is developed. So initially, as I said, you have those 5 patriarchs, but gradually the Patriarch of Rome makes the argument that because Peter, the Apostle Peter, eventually ended up in Rome, that every sort of patriarch of Rome is a successor of Peter. And since Peter was the leader of the apostles, the patriarch of Rome is the leader of all Christians. And so gradually they move away from that term patriarch, and they adopt the term pope, which means Greek for papa, or sort of like a father figure. And that pope is the supreme authority within the entire Roman Catholic Church. And so obviously, not everyone was on board with that. So the Eastern Orthodox Church sort of has this division because they don't accept the authority of the Pope. But for the most part, Western Europe does. And so then the Pope becomes an incredibly powerful figure within the Roman Catholic Church. So fast forward a few hundred years. So the church is established. It is sort of increasing its authority. And one of the things it really focuses on during the period of the 11th century, especially around 1050, is reform. So there are concerns coming from the papacy about some practices that they do not feel are consistent with with church positions. The first is that increasingly secular rulers, especially kings, the Holy Roman Emperor, have been appointing people to ecclesiastical offices. So a bishop dies, the King of England appoints his successor. And in part what the papacy says is no, that only members of the church can appoint other members of the church, that secular rulers don't have that kind of authority. And this is really contested for quite a long time, and we'll look at an example of how it plays out in the Holy Roman Empire. The other thing they do is really establish the clergy as a much more sort of disciplined body with a lot more stringent rules. So that whole idea of celibacy, it's certainly there, but it hasn't really been enforced. It is really common in the 9th and 10th and into the 11th centuries to have priests who openly have wives. They're married. A lot of times their son succeeds them as a priest. And so establishing a celibacy as an absolute standard of behavior for members of the clergy is the focus of a lot of this 11th century reform. They're also really concerned with what they see is sort of rampant secular violence. And this is sort of connected to the feudal system generally, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But you have this sort of fundamental culture within Western Europe based on the way the political system has evolved, where there are a lot of individuals whose sole purpose in society is to fight. Like, that's what they train for, that's what they do. And if you don't have a clear enemy, who are you going to fight? So there's a lot of infighting, a lot of feuding. It's sort of small scale, but it's still extraordinarily disruptive. And what the church tries to do at a certain point is really restrain that violence. So in the late 10th century, they launched a campaign called the Peace of God. And what this says is that, look, you cannot kill women, clergy members, children, sick people, unarmed people. Like, that's especially sinful. So don't do that. The Truce of God comes a little bit later, but builds on that same sentiment, which it says, okay, so there's certain days within the church, rituals that are observed, and on those sort of specifically, those more sort of holy days, you cannot engage in military violence. So Wednesday to Monday, it's out. Also sort of specific durations, like during Lent, during Advent, no fighting. Ultimately, if you add up all of those days when they weren't supposed to fight, or they were violating this idea of the Truce of God, I think there were like 80 days left when they could. So some of these are more effective than others. Some people respond more positively than others, but it's all part of this attempt by the papacy to really sort of change the nature of the church's role within society, and also to sort of change some of those behaviors that it finds disruptive. So the sort of the culmination of a lot of this reform impetus happens in 1095 at the Council of Clermont. And so Pope Urban II travels to Clermont, and this is just sort of a general synod. So people, bishops, priests, monks, even a lot of sort of nobles sort of gather for various reasons at the Council of Clermont. So in a pre-modern world, this is how you disseminate information. You don't have, I mean, you have some letters, but those are sort of hit and miss. This is a way to gather a lot of people together in one space and sort of issue various directives or make pronouncements. So one of the things that actually happens at the Council of Clermont is the Pope rules, he excommunicates the King of France on other business. So it's just sort of this general gathering. But in this particular instance, the Pope really sort of focuses in on what he considers this imperative for members of the Roman Catholic Church to change their behaviors, and in particular to take a more proactive stance against what he sort of describes as Muslim aggressions in the Middle East. And we'll look a little bit more closely at his versions of his speech. But one of the things he says is, look, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius has contacted me and asked for aid. Like, they're on their heels. They no longer have the military power or the resources to hold off these attacking Muslim armies. And so we need to go and help them out. Yeah, we have this religious division, but we're all Christians. And the sort of catalyst to this is the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, when, and this is earlier, right? But that was sort of a real a moment when everyone sort of woke up, because obviously the Byzantine emperor was captured by this Turkish army, and it sort of shook everybody to the core. The other thing that the Pope says they need to do is protect pilgrims. Pilgrims have been traveling down to Jerusalem for centuries, but all of a sudden they're being harassed by local Muslims, and they're not being given access to the holy sites. So we need to establish Christian control over those holy sites, and that's the best way to ensure that pilgrims have access to them and that they're preserved. He talks about destruction of Christian sites, and so obviously this can all be prevented. And so he promises this remission of sins in return to anyone who pledges to go. And according to accounts, the response is sort of overwhelming. He didn't really anticipate how positively this message would be received and how many people would be sort of caught up in this fervor. And so the crowd, according to accounts, the crowd sort of starts to cheer, Deus vult, God wills it. And then he's going to continue to go on this preaching tour of southern France and sort of give the same speech at various locations, spreading this message, which then becomes sort of the catalyst for the First Crusade. So backing up a little bit, what does the political system of Western Europe look like? It is a feudal system. That is a very contentious term. In some respects, it sort of captures everything. In some respects, it's so generalized that it doesn't really describe anything. But we do know that there are some fundamental elements that sort of connect everybody in Western European society in this sort of governing matrix. And it's very unique to Western Europe. It emerges out of the really sort of unstable years, the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, when Europe is being attacked on all sides by Vikings, by Magyars from the east, and from Muslims in the south. And you produce this sort of class of individuals who govern. And the reason why they govern is because they can provide military protection. So it's a really unique sort of political structure where the ability to exercise authority, to own land, to make decisions about law, to make decisions about the well-being of a community is tied to one's sort of military prowess. And so you start to see a series of interpersonal relationships between a lord, who is the superior, and the vassal, who is their inferior. And they enter into this mutually binding relationship where the Lord gives the vassal certain things in return for certain services. And so the key, the glue that holds it all together is homage. So that term sort of refers to a ceremony, and you can see it depicted here where the Lord is sort of clasping the hands of the vassal in his hands. And the terms you often see in documents of this period is he becomes his man. So it's a very personal relationship that an oath of fealty or good faith loyalty is exchanged. One of the, at the core of this is the provision of military service on both sides. But also in return for that service, the Lord will grant the vassal land that the vassal sort of becomes the caretaker for, and eventually control of that land becomes hereditary. So just a quick sketch of some of these major countries across Western Europe who ideally could have, and some did, participate in the First Crusades. So England, you can see here, is not a super active participant in the First Crusade. And in part it's because there's a lot of stuff going on in England that sort of demands their attention. So 1066 is the Norman Conquest, and this is a huge moment in the history of England. So William of Normandy invades England and takes the crown from the current king, and then is going to spend the next 20 years establishing control of England and quelling sort of minor revolts. So when his son, William II, William Rufus, Rufus is the Latin term for red, William had red hair. When he succeeds to the throne in 1087, this is still a very sort of new country, and there's still a lot of challenges to his authority. And one of those challenges actually comes from his brother. So when William I dies, he gives England to his second son, William, and he gives the Duchy of Normandy to his oldest son, Robert, who's known as Robert Courthose, he wears short hose. So Robert's not happy with this. He actually challenges William for control of England. He's not terribly successful. And so at one point, he kind of recognizes that he's never going to control England. And when the crusade sort of comes up, he decides he wants to join the crusade. So he mortgages the Duchy of Normandy to his brother for some unseen amount, like 10,000 marks. It's like a quarter of the annual income of England. But this gives him an enormous amount of funds that he is able to join the crusade, though he is not ever going to be sort of a major player in the crusade. Eventually, when William Rufus dies of a hunting accident, suspiciously, his younger brother Henry then becomes king. And again, in part because of this contested succession, Henry has his hands full dealing with England, and so not terribly actively participating in the First Crusade. Well, the King of France, also not a huge supporter of the First Crusade. A lot of nobles that do go are, and we'll talk about that later. But Philip I is King of France. He's actually the king that's excommunicated by Urban at Clermont because he left his wife and married another woman who happened to already be married. Urban does not think that's okay. It's bigamous. And so when Philip refuses to go back to his first wife, the Pope excommunicates him. So in part because of his personal rift with Urban, Philip doesn't really get on board, but his brother Hugh of Vermandois goes, and as we'll see later, some of the leading figures of the crusade are sort of French nobles from a little bit lower down on the scale. The next sort of major political entity is the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is sort of the legacy of Charlemagne. So it's sort of the eastern part of Charlemagne's domains. It is this sort of loose confederation of independent entities, hundreds of them, the largest being the kingdoms of Germany, Bohemia, and parts of Italy. But the Holy Roman Emperor is sort of this elected office, and his ability to control all of the individuals sort of right below him is always really, really contested. And in particular, at the time when the First Crusade is preached, The Holy Roman Empire has just ended a standoff with the papacy called the Investiture Controversy, and this is part of that papal reform. So, who controls ecclesiastical appointments? Henry IV takes issue with the Pope at the time, Gregory's sort of response that he is no longer allowed to appoint bishops. And this sets off decades of struggle, some militarily, between Henry IV and the Pope. It also leads to civil war within the Holy Roman Empire and challenges to Henry IV's authority. So when the papacy, when Urban then sort of calls for this crusade, Henry also has his hands full, not really interested in advancing any sort of papal cause, and so very little participation from members of the Holy Roman Empire. Norman Italy actually becomes one of the leading sort of forces in the First Crusade. So the Norman Italy is part of Italy that's conquered by Norman Frenchmen. In the 11th century, these Normans come down from France and they lead these expeditions against Muslim-controlled Italy and parts of Byzantine-controlled Italy. And eventually, they managed to sort of carve out an independent kingdom of Italy and Sicily. And one of the local sort of nobles who is very active in the expansion of Norman control in Italy and then becomes a leader of the First Crusade is Bohemond of Taranto. And Bohemond's cousin Tancred of Galilee goes along with them. And we'll see them as we sort of move forward in our investigation into the First Crusade and how it unfolds. So as you can see from this map, if you ignore, if you only look at sort of the dotted lines, you can see that the vast majority of crusaders for the First Crusade, so this is Godfrey of Bouillon, this is Raymond of Toulouse, this is Robert of Normandy, and Bohemond of Taranto. Those are the ones who are active in the First Crusade, and they are the ones who almost exclusively come from France or Norman Italy. And they all sort of meet up in Constantinople and then continue on down. So as we sort of continue on looking at how the First Crusade played out, we will encounter these individuals more, but again, sort of predominantly French in terms of their background, and that's going to have implications moving forward when the Crusader states are established.